Welcome back to the Cineposium podcast, where each week members or collaborators of Cineposium curate films for remote viewing, and then talk about those films on this podcast. In this week's episode, Reed Williams, Kylie Harris, and first-time guest to the show, another graduate student in the Cinema and Media Studies program at UCLA, and an independent film producer, Scott Varnado, discuss two films directed by Chloé Zhao, her 2017 picture, The Rider, and her latest film released this year, Nomadland. Enjoy the conversation.
So today we are going to talk about Chloé Zhao's film The Rider and also her follow-up this year's Nomadland. But before we get into that, we're going to cover a little bit just about Zhao, her background and career and what led her to make these two films. So, and I should also mention that we've got Scott and Kylie here to discuss the film. So welcome to you both.
Thanks, Reed. Thanks for having us.
So Scott, I think you mentioned you were reading a little bit about kind of Zhao's origin story. You want to share a little bit about what you found out?
Yeah, from what I read online, Chloé Zhao, born and raised in Beijing, China, and then moved to New York City. I believe she lived in another city, London briefly, and then to New York for NYU graduate film. And it was during that time that seemingly kind of picked a place, as far as I could tell. She sort of on a whim visited South Dakota and ended up on the Pine Ridge Reservation there, where she eventually ended up making, while still a thesis student at NYU, her first feature, Songs My Brother Taught Me, which came out in 2015. And it was also there that she met Brady, Jandreau, I believe is how you say his last name, who is, of course, the star of The Rider. So I'm just interested, in talking about it, and hopefully we can get into it, what this means, as a person who's making such American stories. I read it written somewhere online too that it's really an ethnographic mode of filmmaking. In an interview, Chloé Zhao stated that she didn't have a Western archetype, like a cowboy archetype. I think she said the first American film she saw in China was like True Lies, So the John Wayne, the whole Western, mid-century John Ford sort of image, it's probably something she came to much later. And I think that's really interesting in looking at The Rider, because, it's an outsider's take, but it doesn't feel like that necessarily, which I think is really curious. So that's just a little bit of the background on the director that I sort of found doing some research online.
Yeah, that outsider part of it's really interesting to me. I think we're always so curious, like who made this and what's their background? Like, do they kind of have the credentials? And are they the most appropriate person to tell this story? And with Zhao, it does seem more like, in this case, like an outsider's point of view offered up insights and things that an insider, someone from that community or from America in general, might not have been able to pick up. So yeah, I think, The Rider and Nomadland illustrate that someone from outside of a community can still tell really powerful, kind of compelling stories if they approach it the right way.
It was interesting too to see. I saw in interview too that Jandreau like contributed a lot to it. Like he wasn't necessarily the screenwriter, but a lot of it was based in his, I think he said about like 60% was real, or at least based on real events, or like realistic to his life. So it was interesting too that like while the filmmaker was an outsider to this community, it still brought up the very real stakes of the community itself, but also the voices and perspectives too. And like he was saying that he immediately felt comfortable when he met her, that like it was, she had like a genuine interest, and wanted to make a film about this community and him in particular. But I thought that was really beautiful too as well.
Yeah, I find it really interesting too that, as an Asian woman and someone who immigrated to the United States, her finding a community with the Native American community. And in another interview I read, Chloé Zhao actually stated that she was often mistaken for a Native person. I think Brady taught her to ride. And she mentioned something, the quote was something along and I'm paraphrasing here, but, an Asian, they thought I was a Native woman in braids, riding the horse until I opened my mouth, but I find that really interesting. And especially now with this really horrible trend we've seen of violence against Asian Americans, that there's some kind of, there's a bond there that she's developed with Brady that I don't think is completely unrelated to the point that these communities have been continually marginalized in our society,
Yeah, totally. I think that relationship she has with, the people in her films, and yeah, specifically Brady too, in the case of the Rider, makes all the difference. And I guess just before we get too deep into the meat of the film, just a quick plot synopsis, if anyone hasn't had the chance to see The Rider yet. It's a super simple story. It follows the character Brady Blackburn, played by Brady Jandreau, and he's essentially telling, as Kylie mentioned, a fictionalized story based on real events that happened in his life and the events that happened in the lives of his friends and family. And so the fact that, Zhao was able to establish the trust with these people to bring those stories out and then get them to act, add that other kind of layer on top of it. It's really impressive. And I think we see her skill in building relationships and in her other work as well. But yeah, let's go ahead and just dive a little bit deeper into The Rider. I know all three of us are fans of this film, and I'm gonna have to catch myself to pronounce it say the D. I always want to be like The Rider, what is it, The Rider? Anyway, but yeah, I know we all love this film, and so I'm curious just to hear kind of why is that? What is it that draws you to it? What are some of the things you noticed? And then maybe we can get into some specific topics and issues of the film.
The first time I watched The Rider, I was struck in that first scene by the realism of Brady's injury. And, we're especially film students, and we're in this mindset of watching films. It's like that thing in film school where they tell you on the first day, movies are going to be ruined for you forever, because you'll be paying attention to the makeup and all these things. And this is a beautiful example of something where you can completely lose yourself almost immediately. And I think it's because even if you haven't read about it or Googled Brady or The Rider or Chloé Zhao, you realize that his injury is real, very soon into the film. And, in the bit of research I was doing, I actually discovered that she had met Brady in 2015, I believe, which was the year that her first feature, Songs My Brother Taught Me, came out. And they didn't have a story. She knew she wanted to make a film with Brady as the star, but the injury happened in April of 2016, and that became the story. So it was really based around that. So that's what strikes me first. And then, and I know we'll get deep into this, but it's just the realism and the male friendships that are depicted and the way that they're depicted. The scenes that stick with me are Brady and Lane, and that I was struck by the first time in the hospital. And I want to talk more about this later. But it's just such a beautiful depiction of caring and loving friendship. But knowing what you know, that both of these men, these young men's injuries are real, you catch yourself, in my case at least, wondering how different it would be if the cameras weren't around. Like, you're really watching a real, true, loving relationship. I think those two men had known each other since they were toddlers, like little children, So I just was absolutely floored by the realism between the um, human characters, but also Brady's depiction. And I know we'll get into this also, but the scenes with the various horses throughout the film and the connection that he has with the animals is just something so true, And I feel like it's something that every filmmaker, depending on your style and genre and mode, but a lot of recent films and a lot of trends are leaning towards this. A lot of independent films, at least, a depiction of something real, of something true. And I think this is one of my favorite films I've ever seen in terms of being able to portray, really meaningful relationships, both human and non-human, on screen.
Yeah, and speaking about the human and non-human, I think that's what struck me the most watching these. I mean, actually, the first time watching this was for a class, and I couldn't actually finish it. I had to stop halfway through because I was just so emotionally affected by the relationship he had with his horse. And after his father sold his horse, and like just that entire scene of him finding out and then riding and then having to give it away, I couldn't continue at that moment, at least that first viewing. But then, when we talked about doing this podcast episode, I was like, okay, I really want to finish watching this because I loved the film. It was just really painful for me. So I came back and finished it this time. And again, definitely the relationships he had with the horses. I mean, it really feels, and I think both also with his relationship with Lane depicted, it feels like it wouldn't be any different if the cameras weren't there. And I mean, he talks about that in interviews too, that some of these scenes of him training horses were real. He was actually training them at the time. And
yeah, the breaking scene.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
filmed almost in real time too, I think. Like,
yeah. I think he said
just did it.
The horse had never been handled,
Yeah.
and that was the first time. So that's incredible. And yeah, so I'm always definitely emotionally affected by films where characters have a really strong connection with animals. But it was such a it was both profoundly beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. And so I think like this line that you're sort of walking the entire film was definitely moving. I mean, I cried multiple times watching it, both times. And so that's why, at least the main reason why I really love this film.
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring that up, Kylie, just how the film walks that line between like heartbreak and beauty. And I think that is partly what resonates with me too, just how the film does kind of straddle um, the space between even like reality, like Scott's talked about, and even like spirituality as well. Like, yeah, there's no doubt that this film's grounded in reality because the characters are essentially playing themselves. But then there is just like it's hard to explain exactly, but there's just this almost like spiritual element imbued throughout the film, and I was sort of wondering why that is, and doing my own research, just learning a little bit more about the Lakota and their system of spirituality. And I couldn't find a ton of sources about that, but there was like an article in the encyclopedia of religion that I thought was interesting. And it says, for the Lakota, religion is not compartmentalized into a separate category. More appropriately, Lakota traditions can be characterized as a system of spirituality that is fully integrated into a rhythm of life. And that makes so much sense now. You know, everything in life has sort of a spiritual component. And so whether it's like at the rodeo where they're like riding bulls and broncos, or training a horse, or working at like even a supermarket like to raise money for the family. You know, it's like we see the real world concerns as far as money and Brady's relationship with his father and his sister, but we also just see how spiritual of an individual he is, and how that impacts and is seen throughout different parts of the film and his life.
Yeah, I feel like that's definitely seen too in just how much Chloé Zhao highlights like sort of like natural landscape. I mean, the landscapes are just breathtaking. And like you see this in the sunrises that he's out with the horses, or the sunsets, and like this sort of, it feels like it's ever present in the film and in his life too.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this in our chat while we were watching together, but I was reminded of Steinbeck's attention to nature and detail, and like those intercorollary chapters in Grapes of Wrath, where it just focuses on this little piece of nature, and in a lot of his work. And it's not a direct relation to this filmmaking, but I feel like that spiritual presence is present in a lot of her formal style. I mean, like you're talking about, Kylie, those shots of the landscape are so much more than just like filler shots, you know? And
Yes.
I'm so glad you brought up his goodbye with Gus. I honestly get choked up just talking about it. It's one of the most beautiful goodbyes. First of all, Gus is like the screen presence of all time. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
of course, is like incredible on film. It's just like you're like drawn in, and you can tell. You know, I haven't spent much time around horses, but it's definitely something I want to do in my life, and I know that I will, and I know they are used for therapy, and they're very, very, you know, obviously just incredibly intelligent and spiritual animals, I think, you know. And I mean that's apparent in a lot of history of Native people here and their connection to it, I think. But yeah, that sequence is just that's for me, when it's such a beautiful sequence, and then it ends with that overhead shot of him riding, and it's just like it takes your breath away. It's just filmmaking at its finest, in my opinion, in a lot of ways, you know.
Yeah, I love that sort of visual motif of him riding horses throughout the film. And it's especially powerful just because about midway through, you find out that he's been medically advised not to even ride horses, like let alone compete in rodeos, but even just to ride a horse would cause further damage to his head injury, which is just devastating. I mean, and especially like we've been talking about, I mean, because it's more than horseback riding, and it's more than just competing in a rodeo. It's like it's very spiritual, and it's very much tied to these characters' identities too. A scene that comes to mind that I know we talked a little bit about while we were watching the film together was that campfire scene where Brady's hanging out with his friends from the rodeo, and they're sort of just swapping stories about the different competitions they've been in and the different injuries they've had. And it is very sort of like bro-y, like guys being guys and drinking beer and joking around with each other. But then there's a really poignant moment at the conclusion of that scene where they all have a prayer together, and it's sort of a combination of like a Christian prayer and then with like what seems to be a Lakota prayer at the end. So again, it's like just you know, walking that line and really bringing out the relationships the characters have with each other.
Yeah, and I think I mean, besides the kind of like masculinity it was showing, but it also showed like how important and passionate like they, or how important it is to them, this aspect of their life, and like how utterly passionate they are about it. And so I think that was really interesting too, to see that it was like so prevalent throughout this friend group and the community.
Yeah, and that scene is such a good scene, and I love the depiction of the male friendships. I mean, I can't think of how many of how little you see men praying together on screen, you know, especially not Lakota men. I mean, that's like, you know, something that you just don't see. But it also starts building. That's where it's like, you know, she's very much like got this fiction narrative film, and that's where you start building the pressure on Brady to keep competing, you know. So it's like it's constantly, the writer is constantly seemingly straddling these things we've been talking about, and you know, not only documentary shots, like I mean the shots of Brady riding, if you isolate those, that's him. That's what he's doing. An actor obviously could have never played this role, you know, and I just love that it's not only straddling that and the narrative, but also, as you both pointed out, sort of the sorrow and the beauty at the same time. And I feel like the fact that it's doing both of those things simultaneously really goes well together.
I think that's another sort of topic that drew all of us to the film, was like the masculinity part of it, and we've been kind of touching on it, but that does, like you kind of said, Scott, like that provides kind of the like point of conflict, because it's, you know, Brady has this really serious head injury and has been advised not to compete again.
The only thing he loves.
Right, exactly. It's like, and the way they describe it in that campfire scene, it's like that's where they feel free too. Like you said, that's where they feel who they are, and actually feel a sense of freedom. And also another thing is just like that's how they make money too. You know, there's like financial pressure coming from Brady's dad at the beginning of the film. Like, well, when are you gonna start again? We need money. So yeah, it's so much of a financial, spiritual, and just tied to your identity and your masculinity too. So yeah, I think, you know, all that is brought out, and it really forces you as the audience to really empathize with the character and see, you know, how significant of a challenge this is for him.
I think that's part of the reason why I couldn't finish it the first time, is because I had sort of assumed, based on like him being pushed into and his desire to, like how important it was to him to keep riding. I assumed that like I thought he was going to take his own life instead of living a life where he couldn't ride. And so I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop the entire time, and was just scared of that happening. But I thought that the way they kind of turned it at the end, where like he could find another life, even just a potentially different life, where he could still, you know, live and have love, like with his family, as you sort of see him going to them instead of joining the rodeo. But yeah, so I thought they do, Chloé Zhao definitely plays up the fact that nobody is all masculine or feminine, that you contain like a world within you, and like you see some really heartfelt emotional scenes from him that kind of straddle this as well. Like he's not purely, you know, stereotypical masculine either. He has this like deep love and sadness when he loses his horse as well. And so yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I'd forgotten how much she builds the motif with the gun, or just the, you know, tension. I mean, there's shots. I think Reed, you referred to it as straight out of a Johnny Cash song, when he's like alone in his bedroom with the gun, and you're just like, well, this is not going to end well.
Yeah, and the scene also where, you know, I mean, with Apollo, he ends up having to take his life because he can't ride anymore. And so then when he's talking to Lily, his sister, I think he says, you know, like, well, so if I had been a horse, that's what would have happened to me. Like, so should, I think at that point he seemed like he was still deciding, like, what was he going to do? Was he going to do that or keep living?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that line up, Kylie. That's one that stuck with me the first time I watched this. Is yeah, if my it's he's saying if my injuries were on a horse or another animal, then I'd have been put down, and that goes for Lane too. And you mentioned the family. You both mentioned his dad and his sister, and for anyone who's listening who hasn't read about that is Brady Gendro's dad and sister, who has Asperger's syndrome. So that just adds a whole nother layer, to the relationships depicted. But I love that scene. There's so much to think about there. If I was a horse, I would have been put down, or if these injuries I have, and it's like, we could get we could get way too deep on that, but it's like, the U.S. also treats the right to die differently than a lot of other countries.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, some of this reminded me a lot of, or at least in talking about it now, reminds me about my grandfather. Because when I was growing up, he would always say, to my uncle, like, take me out to a cliff someday if I ever get, like where I'm going to be, you're dependent on everybody else, and like push me over because I don't want that. But then, when you sort of get to that stage, you have to make different decisions, and it was always difficult for him. So yeah, this was definitely a painful sort of existential crisis that we sort of see playing out in this film.
Yeah, and I think we see that in Nomadland too. Maybe just to transition to that film a little bit, I feel like that's sort of the overall picture with both of them, is that it's about characters who are sort of at this inflection point of their life where things didn't go the way they had planned, and now they're trying to figure out who they are in light of these new circumstances. And it's interesting. I mean, Fern in Nomadland's almost like, I mean, she's an interesting corollary to Brady because she's a middle-aged woman, and she's dealing not only with like the loss of her income, but also like the loss of her entire home in town, and the loss of her husband too, of course. So yeah, this might be a good time to transition to Nomadland and talk a little bit about that too. And on that note, unless there were any other kind of final pieces y'all wanted to mention with the rider.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue. I mean, I think like in both the films, both these sort of central characters are faced with, yeah, who are they without whatever it was that they had before. For Brady, riding or riding in the rodeo, and then for Fern, her husband for one, but also, yes, this life that she had, her house, her friends, her job, and now has to be, like you were saying, it's this inflection point where they have to decide what do they then do, and also not even just who they are, but yeah, what do they want to do with their life? Because I think, like, at least for Fern, it seemed like you sort of find out towards the end that she at some points actually felt stuck where she was before, that she didn't ever leave because of her husband. He wanted to stay there at that job, and so it seemed in a way that she, that almost this sort of nomadic lifestyle was like a direct response to that. So I thought that was really interesting as well about this particular film.
It's a community that's not often depicted. as people in their elder years, in the last phase of life. And a film I just thought of when you were both speaking is Umberto De Sica, and that story. And I hadn't thought of it previously, but there's so many similarities into the main characters in both of these films. And, of course, that was sort of the first wave of neorealism in Italy in the 50s. But yeah, I just, again, with Nomadland, just struck about how Zhao has this ability, it seems like, to depict people on screen. And obviously Nomadland is another film, I think, composed largely of non-professional actors or just non-actors. And it just seems like she's found a way to let people exist with seemingly very little intervention. I think, and I know this is in a number of interviews I was looking at, that she wanted Frances McDormand to feel like she was really living with these people. I'm curious how big the crew was and things like that, but obviously it was probably kept small, I would have to guess. And I think that's part of it, but it's what we touched on earlier too with the Rider is just, it seems like a really large amount of trust and that her actors are putting in her, in how they're going to be portrayed, and very empathetic filmmaking on her part, to really be there.
The documentary aspect definitely caught my eye too, for sure. Like Nomadland especially seems even more maybe documentary just in terms of like, there are just times where people are like talking about themselves and their lives and stuff. So it seems like even more influenced by like documentary aesthetics.
Yeah, I think in part because from what I understand, it's at least partially adapted from this book, Nomadland, Surviving America in the 21st Century. So part of what I'm going to talk about is that this Vulture article by Wilfred Chan, who's discussing Nomadland. But it's really, one thing that I do find slightly troubling in this comparison to the Rider, which seems, at least according to the people talking about it, like to be a very honest and just totally accurate just depiction. Like this, with this one, it does seem like there are aspects of the real characters in Nomadland that at least weren't shown, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, they're not going to show everything, but it does seem like there were some like injuries and different elements that the characters faced, sort of living this kind of gig nomadic, sort of doing these really physically demanding work that sort of wasn't shown exactly. So I felt like I wished that had been more incorporated, because that was included in the book. So I felt like that was one thing I was a bit concerned about. But and as it was discussed in this Vulture article by Chan, but overall, yeah, I mean, I think it was like a really interesting sort of, just like with the Rider, walking this line between sort of more documentary style, realistic, and like a fictional narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it really does that well. I'm thinking of the couple of scenes in particular. I was reading a bit about Derek Indres, I think is his name. He's a Wanaki native who's the guy that bums a cigarette, and then that she meets later on. And it was in an interview recently published with Barry Jenkins that Chloé Zhao stated that he's obviously a non-actor, and that's what he was doing, I think, when they found him, he was very content with his lifestyle, and all these people were. And the scene that I just loved is when Swanky describes the birds on the water, in her kayak, you know, and that she could go then and be a happy person. I mean, that is undoubtedly a real experience that this woman has had. And, you know, it's funny to use the term documentary style in a, you know, very carefully constructed narrative film. But if you isolate those moments, then that's the realness and the you know, life experiences that are coming across from these people that aren't in other films that are heavily, you know, written and constructed. And, you know, that's why I get back, you know, to that term, maybe I'm wrong here, but it seems like an ethnography in a way, you know, like or just a document, you know, of this section of society that's very little documented, you know, very rarely documented.
And also incorporated into the story, kind of as you were saying, because part of, I think, seemed to me at least, part of why what was so important to her about this kind of nomadic lifestyle was the people that she met and like these connections that she made. Like she made such deep connections with, yes, just someone over, you know, a cigarette, sharing a cigarette, or you know, someone she meets at her job, or like on during the what do you call that? Like where they met up a bunch of people who were sort of living this nomadic lifestyle, kind of like a retreat in a way. I forget what the name of it was.
Yeah, it almost felt like their version of like a Burning Man.
Yeah,
even when they like burn the cardboard van at the end. So like, yeah, I guess kind of like a conference or retreat, or yeah, sort of like a Burning Man. Yeah.
It seems slightly spiritual.
I think it's real. Oh, sorry, I didn't.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, I think it's a real life nomad, Bob Wells, who was leading that sort of retreat in those scenes.
Oh, right. Okay. So one thing I was curious to get your thoughts on was the relationship between Fern and the character Dave in the film, who is set up as Fern's romantic interest. And I thought their relationship and how that subplot played out was kind of interesting. On the one hand, if you're being cynical, I guess you could see that as sort of like, well, they're shoehorning in a love story to like make it more accessible to a general audience or something. But then on the other hand, there were parts of their relationship on screen that I thought were pretty endearing too. I mean, like the whole thing with Dave, he accidentally breaks like one of Fern's plates that means a lot to her. And then later on, like they meet again, kind of tries to make it up to her. And yeah, I guess I don't know exactly how I felt about that relationship. I think like I liked it overall, but I'm not sure how much it actually contributes to the film or not, and was curious to hear what you both think about that.
I thought it was really interesting because, you know, being a sort of hopeless romantic, I wanted them to get together. But at the same time, I do feel like it played well into the themes that she's sort of trying to come across, because I feel like for Fern, possibly like this love interest and like this connection, this potential partnership could have like thrown her back to her previous marriage. And so like maybe it was either a draw to kind of leave that nomadic lifestyle, or it could have been something that maybe she didn't want to go back to that. So I felt like it was kind of ambiguous and ambiguous about what she ends up deciding in the end, the way they kind of leave it. But I thought it incorporated well some of these sort of choices that she's having to make. Like, does she continue this nomadic lifestyle sort of on her own, or does she, you know, at some point decide to sort of settle down with him and live maybe a more comfortable life? But, you know, whether she does, like, it seems like she doesn't, but who knows?
Yeah, you do never know. And I thought immediately on the ending there, I think it's Bob Wells who has that beautiful statement about how you never really say goodbye. There's no final goodbyes in this lifestyle. And, you know, that's kind of like the one of the themes of the whole film that stuck out for me. I do think on a filmmaking note, it's interesting to note that the character that plays her love interest, the actor rather, is longtime professional actor. He actually started out in John Sayles films, in John Sayles' debut, and has been around for a long time. So it's interesting to see Chloé Zhao moving, from the previous two films that are very much composed in almost entirely of non-actors, to this more, Frances McDormand and David Strathairn, I think is how you say it. And these are two, wonderful actors. So it's really kind of a progression, I feel like, in her career. And of course, she's already shot Eternals, which I'm guessing the Marvel film is not going to have many non-actors in it. I could be wrong, but so it's going to be interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like Nomadland definitely had like a similar kind of flavor or feel to the Rider, but yeah, having Frances McDormand as like the lead character and performer definitely does introduce like a different dynamic, and having other professional actors as well kind of mingled with non-actors or non-professional actors or whatever term you want to use. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. I wonder if I wonder how future work will play out, if it'll continue to use sort of real life people talking about their experiences, or if it'll lean more into kind of the Hollywood style filmmaking.
From what I understand too, it seemed like Frances McDormand had a big role in the making of the film too, because it's from what I read, she was the one that sort of made them able to film at Amazon, because she was one that contacted them and got permission by Amazon to do that, which I was actually like, when I was watching the film, I was like, oh my gosh, is this really an Amazon warehouse? How did they get in there? Because I was like, there's no way. How are they gonna, how would Amazon allow that? But I think it makes sense after having watched the whole film now. I feel like it makes sense because I mean, one, Frances McDormand is like a very well-known actor, but also they didn't really depict it in a particularly negative light. I don't think they were trying to like make a big statement about Amazon warehouses or even necessarily gig work, because they had the sort of Amazon job for her was the job that like she made the most money in, that she could go back to, and they showed that Amazon provided like a stipend for their camper force, as a part of the camper force to put their vans and basically live in, and then on the job you see them generally looking pretty happy, not particularly distressed or dealing with any seeming suffering. So good or bad, that's I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I was surprised at how sort of easy she took it on Amazon too. But when you are filming at Amazon and it's not like a very thinly veiled stand-in, then there's probably only so far.
Right.
Yeah, but I think it's there's not to say there's two sides to it, but Amazon was providing a vital paycheck for a lot of these people, and still it was not, that stipend I don't think was very much, or the pay that we all know, hopefully, how just appalling some of the work workplace situations and the anti-unionization and all this with Amazon. But I think in this film it almost doesn't matter. It's interesting because I think Chloé Zhao is relying on the fact that people know a lot more than what she explores about Amazon in this, but it also does provide another viewpoint of it. But I think the thing in Nomadland that's really interesting, and especially in looking at it from the perspective of someone who moved here, who immigrated here and made this film. I watched this film with my wife, who is born and raised in the Netherlands and didn't come to the United States so much later. And I kind of get to see things sometimes through her eyes. And she was just, in a way, more affected by how these people are kind of just forgotten in a lot of ways by the capitalist, machine that we live in, that you work your whole life and your benefits can disappear and your social security can disappear for various reasons in seemingly a second, and in watching it with Charlie, I realized, my wife, that it's a very unique American thing that is happening, to these people who are in the last part of their life and still having to work jobs at Amazon to get by,
And I think you can. Oh, sorry, Kylie. Go ahead.
Oh, you go. You go.
I was just gonna say, like, I think you can see that contrast to when Fern goes to visit her sister and brother-in-law, and they are living the American dream, in air quotes, I guess. They have their own home. They're talking about these jobs that they have and promotions. It's very kind of, what we think of when we think of domestic American life. So seeing that contrast, you can see why the nomad life appeals to Fern, despite kind of its challenges and kind of hardships.
Totally. But I love what her sister says. That was really unexpected to me, that instead of, coming down on her, and I don't know if it's like this kind of filmic tradition of, you have the like archetypal sister or brother that's like disproving of your lifestyle. And I was kind of expecting that, but she genuinely says, I think what Fern is doing is beautiful, in a way, that it's in the tradition of the pioneers, as she calls them. I like that.
She stood up against what the other family members were saying about her. I appreciated that too. Thought that was really beautiful moment. Yeah, I mean, I think while I didn't love the depictions within the Amazon within the Amazon factory, I do appreciate everything surrounding it. So, like, while it might not have looked necessarily as realistic as it probably is, it still showed the hardships that she faced sort of in living. Like, you sort of see how cold it is, how she's sort of dependent on like the time of year that like this job is available. Like, it's not like a permanent job that she has. It's you see her, she has to like poop in a bucket. Like, there's lots of different aspects of it that aren't glamorized or sort of made to appear too pleasant or likable. So I think that was really great. And also I think in reading sort of our interviews about it, Fern is never shown like as a victim. She always sort of has this agency, so she could go live with her sister if she wanted to escape that. But like, she does want to live a more nomadic lifestyle and doesn't want to, at least during this time that we're seeing of her life. She wants to sort of have this freedom and sort of explore and like meet all these different people and have these different experiences. So I think I definitely appreciated that aspect of it.
Yeah, it doesn't I agree, like it doesn't pity people who live as nomads, but it also doesn't like romanticize it as sort of like a hashtag like van life,
yes,
Instagram
exactly.
influencer kind of phenomenon. So
exactly. How did you both feel about the fact that, at least for Fern, this was a voluntary lifestyle? It wasn't necessarily as easy to tell about the other characters whether it was, but I wonder about that because, I mean, for many people, it's not voluntary.
That's
Um, and so
yeah, you should definitely cut out the part that I said earlier. I don't know what I was talking about.
no, it's okay, it's okay. Yeah, so I don't know how I feel about it. Like I don't know. The thing is, I'm not sure about like Swanky and the Linda May
Swanky was definitely a choice. She was so
choice.
passionate about riding her kayak, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I love that character, man. What an amazing
Yeah, they were really cool.
and her trailer and all her little stuff, you know, that she's given away. And then when they were throwing the rocks on the fire for her, it's so brief. Just a little scene.
I wonder if maybe they, I don't know if I should say this. I was just gonna say, like, don't you guys think they should potentially highlight more people who didn't choose this though, or like, I don't know.
No, I don't feel that way. I feel like the writer follows in the tradition of Chloé Zhao's work so far that captures a section of the population that we don't really see often, but also leaves it up to us to make up our minds about how we feel about some people. You know, like you pointed out, Kylie, it seems like a voluntary lifestyle for most in Nomadland, but it's true, it may not be for some, you know, and I think that goes along with there is a somber tone to this film. There is a feeling of, you know, maybe she wants to continue the lifestyle, or someone living this wants to continue that way, but maybe it wasn't their choice to start it to begin with, you know. And something I like about this film is that you're not given that information specifically, you know.
Yeah, it is really up for interpretation, which I absolutely appreciate.
It is an interesting question, though, like, especially given the fact that Frances McDormand did drive this project too, and like that she thought of this, like that she calls Fern kind of her alter ego. Like, you know, I think you could make the argument that this is like sort of like a powerful Hollywood person kind of living out their fantasies, I guess, at the expense of, like you're sort of saying, Kylie, people who are experiencing economic hardship and maybe have to be nomads. So yeah, I think it is a fair question for sure. And yeah, like you said, I don't know exactly how to grapple with it either. I mean,
but either way, it does, at least, even whether or not they're voluntary or not in this film, it at least does show that it is not an easy life, and that there aren't necessarily that many steps in between this life and disaster, whether it's, you know, like with the van breaking down, and if she didn't have her sister, like who knows what would have happened if she couldn't get that $2,000 to fix it. So I think that is appreciated, and that, like, you know, they're having to deal with health issues and decide, you know, what to do in the face of death, like how they want to live the rest of their days, whether they want to live in the hospital or not, and just do what they love. So I think that was really great too. So I think it at least, whether or not, you know, these characters decided, or these people decided or chose or didn't choose to live this lifestyle, I think it at least does show these lives that, like, you wouldn't necessarily see in a normal Hollywood film.
Yeah, what you said about being a paycheck or $1,000 away from, you know, complete despair. I mean, it's interesting watching this film that has come out during the global pandemic and fallout, but doesn't obviously address it specifically. But a lot of these issues would be and are going to be issues, major things to overcome for, you know, people all over the world right now. You know, so it's certainly timely without necessarily you know, setting out to be. You know, it's interesting that she can get away with having Frances McDormand in this lead role, because I can't think of a more recognizable, you know, actor. And I think I remember reading during production that someone actually offered Frances McDormand a job at a Walmart, I think it was, while they were filming this, you know. But I was thinking about that, you know, while we've been talking, that Chloé Zhao's made this move, this leap to using two really fine actors in these lead roles, and one is probably one of the most well-known American actors, you know, Frances McDormand, living, and yet it speaks obviously to her talent that, you know, I didn't find myself feeling like I was watching a Frances McDormand film. You know, I was able to kind of lose yourself in the way we were talking about the way that happens with the writer really early on into the story and into the characters, and I think that obviously is due to the talent of Miss McDormand, but also just the fact that this entire world is depicted so carefully, and that the people surrounding her, you know, are real people, and that some of the moments involving, you know, I'm thinking of the spa scene, you know, when they have the face masks on, and it's real moments, you know, and I feel like I'm sure Frances McDormand took that and just ran with it and just really embedded herself, you know, and it really shows. You're really able to, you know, it's a very unique role for her in a lot of ways. I think it's like a role that is a long time coming. I feel like, you know.
That makes sense. I feel like I read her mentioning that this is almost like her alter ego in her imagination, that, like, you know, in some parallel universe she would actually be Fern and would be traveling around the country. So I think the investment in the performance makes a huge difference. I mean, she's a great actor already, but, you know, just how passionate she is about the role, and, you know, while still giving like a pretty understated performance, there's no really like scenery chewing. A lot of it's nonverbal. A lot of it's like kind of in the looks she gives people, in her eyes, face. It really is a pretty remarkable performance.
And a lot of the moments are just her alone in like her day-to-day life of living on the road and living by herself in this van, and like her, in a way, her relationship with the van too at times. But yeah, I thought this sort of emphasis on like the everyday was also really great too in the film.
So I know we've talked a little bit about similarities between The Rider and Nomadland, but are there any others that you two want to talk about before we wrap things up?
Yeah, I feel like there's a similarity in between The Rider and Nomadland, in that it straddles that same emotional space between sorrow and beauty, you know, and that it's not overly in each category, and based on who you are and where you are in life, and, you know, how you're feeling that day, you know, you could have very different emotional reactions to any film, but particularly to Nomadland. I thought that it existed a little more, perhaps, in sort of the traditional narrative filmmaking space. I noticed the score a lot more. I mean, the score in The Rider is just absolutely beautiful, but I noticed kind of a more somber tone in the music in Nomadland.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that the score did sort of counteract the fact that that they aren't sort of romanticizing this potential nomadic lifestyle, because while they don't want to make it what some people call poverty porn, where it's just this, you know, kind of suffering, like that. Still, though, the score kind of gives a sort of sadness, or a taste of the sort of difficultness of it, while without being that over the top, you know, everything is horrible kind of a take.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too. And it's such a key part of both films is, like we said, walking that line. And so even something like as seemingly like unnoticeable as the score plays a huge part. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, we definitely, I know all three of us can recommend The Rider and Nomadland if you haven't already seen them. And if you have, feel free to let us know what you think on Instagram, on Twitter. And again, thank you both for this discussion. It's been great.
That's it for our show this week. Thank you for listening and for your support. Please subscribe to the show on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at Cineposium and on Twitter at Cposium to keep up with our updates and to keep in communication with us. Until next week, take care, everyone.